I'm Matt.
I'm Carrie.
We are the Stagmer Brothers of Baltimore Knife and Sword. We're going to be building some of your favorite weapons, and some weapons that you've never seen before.
This is Man-at-Arms, Reforged.
So we've made quite a few katana builds on the show. They're always a fan favorite, but nothing's been requested as much as Kenshin's reverse blade katana.
That's right. The Sakabato from Samurai X, as well as the Rurouni Kenshin series, has been by far the #1 requested sword on the channel throughout its existence. And this time, not only am I happy making it, it is also very relaxing to make the first time and non-lethal weapon.
And as always, we're going to be using traditional materials and traditional methods. Let's get at it.
Alright. To begin the work on the reverse blade katana, I have these two pieces of tamahagane. These will have to be flattened and welded on to my holding stick. The holding stick, appropriately, has a little bit of tamahagane pre-folded, welded onto it, so that I'm not going to contaminate my material. I'm going to do a bunch of folds to purify the material, make it usable for a blade. After that, I will start forging out the final shape. Now, as per your requests, we're going to shorten the forging section of this episode and focus on the delicate and intricate portion of making the fittings for the katana. After all, the reverse blade only becomes unique when you add a scabbard to it.
To forge out traditional katanas, many times Japanese smiths work in tandem. In this case, I'll be assisting Ilya in the hot cut and fold process. We first remove the billet from the fire, then Ilya uses a hot cut tool and I use a sledgehammer to cut about 90% of the way through the billet. Once the cut is complete, Ilya sprinkles a little borax on the surfaces that will be closed upon themselves. I hold the billet down with my sledge and he bends it 90 degrees over the corner of the anvil. He then closes the billet and uses his hammer as a flatter as I gently tap the billet closed. Now, we return it to the heat and repeat the process several more times until Ilya feels the material is ready to be drawn out into a blade. To speed up the process, Ilya is going to be using a Bradley power hammer in between some of the heats to not only forge weld, but draw out the billet before we fold once again.
This idea of a reverse blade katana is very interesting to me personally because it captures two moments in Japanese history that almost mirror each other. The first one is the Meiji era, the era of Japanese modernization and westernization. The old customs of dueling and killing people at the crossroads were being extinguished. It also reflects a series of laws, the prohibition of wearing of swords, that start in 1817, which almost completely obliterated the sword industry in Japan.
Now that Ilya is satisfied with the refining of the bloom, he's going to be able to take the bar of this material, draw it out on the nacelle hammer, and create the basic form of this blade. He'll have to do handwork afterwards, but this is a good start.
With the blade blank now drawn out to length, it's time to hot cut the tip off and begin beveling.
In the anime and in the manga, you see Kenshin using a reverse blade katana, which is basically not a katana, as it doesn't have the edge on the proper side. The reason why he does that is so that he doesn't kill people, otherwise it will onset his PTSD and he will become a maniac killing everybody. And that's why his friend the smith has given him the sword of peace, the sword that doesn't kill. The first sword breaks, but the second is found in a shrine. The tradition of giving swords to shrines, to the gods, is a very old one in Japan. And the sword that doesn't kill is symbolically the gift to the gods of peace in Japan. No more killing, no more murder.
Working over the anvil, Ilya now sets the curve in for this blade. He'll have to slightly increase the curve because when he does the quench, the piece will begin to straighten out.
In the manga as well as in the anime, Kenshin is notorious for his extreme speed. That means his sword has to be relatively short and fairly thin. The standard length for a katana is approximately 24, 25, 26 inches, not very long blade length. Here I have a sword made by the father of the modern Tokenkai, the modern Japanese schools of sword making, of Kuniya Yoshihara, the grandfather of the really famous Yoshinda Yoshihara. As you can see, it is fairly short. What's more important, it is relatively thin. So this is kind of what I imagine Kenshin's sword being, maybe a little bit longer, and the edge being on the opposite side. To make the tsuba, the guard on the katana, I'm going to use this piece of iron. This particular piece came from the renovations done in Washington, D.C. and probably dates to the 19th or 18th century. I'm going to heat this piece up and cut off the excess, as there's way too much material for that guard. Then I'm going to flatten it out a bit more as it's too thick and start rounding it out, as Kenshin's tsuba is round.
So at this point, we forged the tsuba. Ilya has gone in and decked all the surfaces flat and ground it nice and round. And if you watch the anime, you'll notice that's just about how the tsuba looks. It's very plain, just has two little D shapes cut out on either side of the tang slot. But if you look at historical tsubas, there's a very subtle detail that makes a tsuba go from being plain to being very beautiful. And that is just having a slight dome to the surface. So I'm gonna go to an 80 grit sander, start removing material from the edge, create my outer bevel, and as I progress through the grits, I'll be rounding it over more and more and more, and then we'll be ready to do the piercing work.
In the anime as well as in the manga, the tsuba for Kenshin's sword is very reminiscent of the tsuba that was said to have been designed by Miyamoto Musashi. In fact, the life history of Miyamoto Musashi mimics Kenshin's quite well, as the former is known to have become a Buddhist priest and quite an accomplished artist. However, Kenshin's tsuba is fairly different in that the piercings are fairly angular. I use a jeweler's saw and a drill to first put the holes in and then cut them out by hand, which is the very traditional method of doing this. The final procedure before heat treating is the traditional technique of applying clay to a Japanese blade. This is done in two stages. The first one is applying a very thin layer of clay that has an excess of ground stone dust in it. It increases the surface area and therefore speeds up the cooling process. The second stage is applying a thicker layer of clay to the spine. That insulates the steel from the cold water and therefore slows down the cooling process. I mentioned earlier that Rurouni Kenshin series, the manga as well as the anime, captured two critical moments in Japanese history, the first being the Meiji era. The second one is actually the history of Japan after the Second World War. Japanese society was plagued by an intense shame, not only because of their loss, but also because of the political consequences of what that loss entailed. So, from then on, especially from 1970s, a constant stream of the subplot in anime was that the protagonist is incredibly strong, but has a dark past, and they have to restrain themselves in order to make the world better.
With the blade at temperature and clayed, Ilya now goes to a water quench. The blade's going to change in form slightly. We'll have to keep it in water and keep it moving until it finishes its form.
Once the blade is sufficiently polished, The actual edged portion is protected with a piece of paper so I don't damage it, and it's now time to make the habaki. The habaki acts as a ricasso on a Japanese sword. It also has a structural purpose. Because it is made usually from softer materials than the blade itself, it absorbs the shock. The way we're going to form our habaki, we take this annealed piece of copper and start striking couple lines and forging out the wings on either side.
Using a torch, Ilya now anneals the copper. He's going to bring it up to where it just slightly starts to glow and quench into water. This will actually make the copper very soft, the reverse of what happens with steel, which would make the steel very hard.
In order for the habaki to locate well on the blade, I have to cut out a small shelf where the muni, or the back edge of the sword, will sit. So I use a hacksaw and a set of files to first mark my opening, cut it, and then file it square. One of the most tedious parts about making the habaki is soldering the machigane, the little wedge that's right here, to the rest of the habaki. I'm using sterling silver as solder because it has a 300-degree lower melting point than copper, so it should be perfect. And I have some borax dissolved in water as my flux.
Working at the fly press, Ilya now takes a die set that he's made and creates the sections for the fushi and kashira. He's able to take a flat piece of material, drive it down, and it'll create that cup, and it'll be completely deformed with no welds or soldering.
Just like the kashira, I use the extrusion method to make my fushi. Then I cut off the top. The reason is the top will never be flat, and we need a flat surface where the tsuba rides and the rest of the fittings. And traditionally, if you're using iron, you have to inlay a piece of copper instead of soldering it. In order to do that, I cut out a small channel inside and size my copper. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to place this piece of copper in, press it in, and from the inside I'm going to hammer it. As the copper expands, it will fit into that channel perfectly. To make the wooden parts of the handle sit well on the tang, chisels specifically designed for that purpose are utilized. Those chisels are fairly curved in order to access some of the intricate points. By having the recess mimic the geometry of the tang, the pressure hugging the tang is so perfect that the stress from the mikugi pin is being relieved to a great extent. And that is why in Japanese swords, the entire sword can be assembled with just one pin. At this point I have to prepare the sami wrap, or rather raiskin. When it's dry, raiskin is hard because it's rawhide, so what I'll have to do, I'll have to soak it in warm water overnight. Once the raiskin is pliable, I will use a template to cut out the important part that will go on my handle. The key point is to have these nodules that are fairly wide located at a strategic point by the kashira on the outside when the sword is worn. So my handle will be cut out around here. Once the race skin has been properly soaked, it becomes very flexible, almost like Play-Doh. Then I use a rough template that mimics the shape of the handle fairly well. I cut it out and wrap the race skin around the handle and let it sit for about a day or so. The reason is, race skin when it dries out shrinks quite a lot, so I will have to wait till the race skin is dry, open it up, and trim the excess, accounting for the next shrinkage. To make the minuki, a technique is employed known as uchidashi. Uchidashi is significantly different from the Western chasing and repoussé technique. Chasing, strictly speaking, means line work, and repoussé means working from the back. Uchidashi employs a different route. What the craftsman does, they take a relatively flat piece of metal and start gathering it around, dragging the material, gaining the volume, without working from the back. That thickens the material from the sides and to the top. It is very similar to raising along a stake, except in this case the pitch is the stake that's very malleable. After sufficient volume is achieved, the pieces are annealed or softened, and the craftsman either does line work with a very fine chisel or cuts away the grooves and then pushes the material around to achieve the final result.
Now that Ilya has the form for the minuki finished, he'll lay in a little bit of detail and then come through with a special chisel and cut around the outside perimeter.
I will have to slightly wet the race skin again and wrap it around the handle, this time with some glue in between the wood and the skin. As mentioned earlier, the law prohibiting the wearing of swords put swordsmiths out of business. As swordsmiths, a lot of swordsmiths went into making other things that are kind of related to what they were doing before. And here I have in front of me a pair of scissors that are clearly made by a sword maker around the Meiji era. These scissors have a delicate hamon that is clearly intentional. These specific scissors were probably made for ritualistic purpose of trimming fletching on Kyudo arrows. However, scissors are not the only case. The historical analogs of a reverse blade katana actually come from the tea ceremony. During the tea ceremony, it is improper or prohibited to wear a weapon. However, many samurai and members of the upper class would commission daggers with either an ostentatious curve or a reverse curve, and those blades would be allowed in the ceremony as the excuse is they're flower arrangement knives. So a member of the upper classes would have a weapon they can use at the same time as bypassing the rules and regulations. Since Kenshin is a simple man wrapping the sword handle, we're doing the fairly regular and the common method. A set of paper wedges have to be inserted under the Ito wrap in order to bulk it up. The wrap has to alternate, crisscross, as it has been thought that alternating them prevents a cut strap from unwinding the whole handle. One of the stressful points about making a Japanese scabbard is fitting the koeguchi, or the horn fitting, on the mouth of the scabbard. The opening that you see is relieved perfectly to hug the habaki, that way the scabbard doesn't fall off the sword or the sword doesn't fall out of the scabbard. However, when the martial artist can withdraw the sword, it is very often the case that the sword is sharp enough to cut through the scabbard, and that is where the horn comes in. So I take a set of chisels, a jeweler's saw, and a file, and slowly relieve some area on the sides of the scabbard. Then I perfectly mimic that geometry in the horn, and the horn koeguchi, the mouth, is pressure fit onto the wood. Okay, the scabbard has been carved out. Let's see how it slides on. Airtight. I don't want to close this because if I stick it on, I will not be able to pull it off. Because I'm painting the scabbard later, the koiguchi is sized to the scabbard as it is now, and the paint occupies some space. So what I will have to do is unwrap the scabbard and shave off a little bit from all around. This is a plane from Japan. The difference between a Western plane and a Japanese plane: Western planes you push, Japanese planes you pull.
As Ilya paints the scabbard, he'll give it texture and form by sprinkling charcoal over the surface. He's got to be very careful to keep this even throughout the entire length.
Ilya went way out of his way to showcase this sword, and I think it was a really good decision to show a lot of the finer details that we usually skip on katana builds. With the unique shape and the reverse edge of this katana, the demo should be one of a kind.
Click here to subscribe, or click here to watch more episodes. Thanks for watching Man-at-Arms Reforged. We need to know what you want the guys to build, so tell us in the comments below what weapons you want to see next.